The economy of the 50s and 60s was caused by many things. The post-war economy was one such thing. World War II ended on May 7th, 1945, but the wartime economy continued to grow rapidly even after the war ended. Throughout WW II, 17 million jobs were created and wages increased by 50%. The lack of goods during the war combined with the now increased purchase power caused people to buy lots of goods. For example, 21.4 million cars were bought in the 5 years after the war. This shows that people had excess capital and said capital was spent quickly, in turn boosting the economy. One law that aided the post-war economy was the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, also known as the GI Bill of Rights. Created in 1944, it lowered mortgage and interest rates, allowing for cheap homes and new businesses. It also gave veterans a cheap college education, allowing for the skilled workforce to be rebuilt. Let's look at some graphs pertaining to the 50s and 60s. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, often referred to as the DJIA, tracks how well the top 30 publicly traded companies are doing on the stock market. It is a common method of tracking the growth of the economy. This graph shows that from 1950 to 1969, the price increased from $2,710.04 per share to $7,980.33. That is roughly a 3 times increase. The S&P 500 is very similar to the DJIA, but one key difference is that it consists of 500 stocks instead of 30. From 1950 to 1969, it increased from $250.09 to $897. This is around a 3.5 times increase. Both of the graphs combined give a great look into how the economy in the 50s and 60s was. Now that we know what the base economy is like, we can now talk about the 3 brief recessions. The post-Korean War recession was a period of economic contraction which occurred from 1953 to 1954. It was characterized by increased unemployment, reduced industrial production, and decreased consumer spending. In 1953, at the end of the Korean War, military spending was reduced by roughly $14 billion, meaning it had decreased nearly 20% from its peak during the war. Because of this, there was less of a demand for war-related goods and reduced industrial production and loss of jobs. During the war, in 1951, the inflation rate had reached 7.9%. As a response, the Federal Reserve implemented tighter monetary policies, which would lead to higher interest rates and reduced access to credit for consumers. In the duration of the recession, consumer spending decreased by 1.5%, industrial production decreased by 10%, the unemployment rate increased by 3.2%, and there was a 2.2% decline in Rio's domestic product, or GDP. As an attempt to bounce back from this recession, the Eisenhower administration enacted the Revenue Act of 1954, which was intended to counteract the adverse effects of the recession. In addition, the Federal Reserve also lowered interest rates. The Eisenhower recession, which is the second of the 3, was a decline in the United States economy that began in August 1957 and lasted until April 1958. The main cause for this recession was the tight monetary policy run by Chairman William McChesney Martin on the Federal Reserve, which increased federal funds from 2.5% to 3.5% by mid-year of 1957. The reduction of consumer confidence due to events such as the Suez Crisis in 1956 and launch of Sputnik in 1957, and the downturn of automobile and housing industries, which played a massive role in the economy's uprising post-war. This recession resulted in the unemployment rates increasing by 3.4% to a 7.5% rate by June of 1957, the stock market taking a serious loss with the S&P index dropping by over 20%, and industrial production decreased by nearly 14%. The rolling adjustment recession was a period of economic decrease that affected the financial markets and various parts of society that ranged from 1960 to 1961. This recession was triggered by the tight monetary policy that made the federal funds raise 4.01% by 1960 and slowed economic growth, industrial overproduction to meet post-war demands, global economic slowdown, currency fluctuations, and trade deficit. The rolling adjustment recession prompted problems like the unemployment rate to roughly stay the same at 7.1% in May of 1961, the GDP to decrease by 1.6%, the industrial production to continue dropping by 9.1% from its peak in 1960, and business investments to reduce by 14%. Harry Truman's mid-year report was given on July 26, 1950, and touched multiple topics of economics. These topics included industrial production, civil employment, economic developments, and other industries' productions. The economic developments included wholesale prices rising by 4%, customer prices rose by 1.6%, annual wages increased to a seasonally adjusted annual rate of $4.3 billion higher than the rate since the first quarter of 1950. Manufacturing wages reached a peak of $1.45 an hour. Companies' profits were 17% higher than last year's without taxation. Personal consumption increased by 2.2% since the fourth quarter of 1949. And construction activity rose, which caused the cost of resources and labor to increase along with it. This is a clip of Henry Taylor, a journalist for the papers, who talks about his opinion on the high tax rates of America in the early 1960s.
The average American family, as perhaps you know, spends about a quarter of its income for food. And yet we pay more for taxes than we pay for our food and clothing combined. And every time we turn around, we hear the demand that the government still needs more money. They never get enough. Well, now, of course, to an extent, this is true, providing you're going to relate the amount of money that the government needs to what we need. That is to say, to human wants, human desires. And that's a very, very appealing thing. Affects me the same as it does you. But the point is that we pay for every penny. And someplace in here, this government of ours, having grown as vast as it is, has got to establish a priority of the needs for the money that we spend.
The economic growth and development still has some effects that can be seen today. This can be shown by things like companies that are still around today. For example, Dunkin' Donuts was founded in the year 1950 and is still widely popular today. Other examples of companies are IHOP, Pizza Hut, Trader Joe's, and Little Caesars. A lot of the big companies in the 50s, like General Motors or Amoco, were in some way related to automotive industrialization of the time. There were also many well-known CEOs in the 1950s, including Raymond Kroc of McDonald's and Berry Gordy Jr. of Motown Records. These types of things that are still widely known today show how impactful the economic growth of the 50s and 60s was, and why it was called the Golden Age of Capitalism.